Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first event that we are hosting this year. My name is Bente Scheller. I'm head of Heinrich-Böll Foundation's Middle East Division, and in this capacity, I welcome you to this event. We will all be speaking in English. If you need translation, if you need interpretation, please avail yourself of a headset. And I'm not sure, können wir das hier ausschalten? Das ist zu laut hier. So today's topic will be on Syria. As you know, the Foundation for a long time has been following up on Syria and discussing different questions. And today the topic is on humanitarian aid. As you know, humanitarian aid is supposed to be delivered in a neutral way, needs-based, impartial. It has very high demands, so it should be respected, which is, of course, difficult in any context. And today, we would like to discuss how that figures out in Syria, because there is a dire economic and humanitarian need in Syria after 11 years of conflict, 11 years after large shares of the Syrian population took to the streets to demand dignity and freedom. There is a really dire humanitarian situation. 90% of the population live in poverty. It is a topic across all areas of Syria. I think the assessment is that by this year, more than 15 million people in Syria will be in need of humanitarian assistance, and that is, of course, huge. And we have different complexities in this case. On the one hand, of course, there is a kind of donor fatigue. We have growing demands, but less funds to help the situation. And then, of course, the divisions in Syria are also important, because we have basically three areas. About 65% of Syria are controlled by the Syrian regime. About 30% are controlled mainly by the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are led by Kurds, all the areas east of Euphrates and then Syria's northeast. And then in the northwest, we have Idlib as last rebel-held province. A few days ago, I think we were all relieved to see the UN Security Council taking a new resolution to extend the cross-border aid delivery into Idlib. But of course, the problem is it is just for another 6 months, and we will have the same problems that we had before again soon on the table. So I think it is great that today I have a very distinguished panel here with me to discuss these questions, because a lot of studies have been done around humanitarian aid, and particularly the problem of politicization of humanitarian aid. I mean, there are different ways in which this has happened. We've seen sieges in Syria, starvation as a weapon of war, withholding humanitarian aid, and hitting the health sector particularly, but also on the international level, that there is a need for a Security Council mandate to deliver cross-border is, of course, also something that has political implications. Therefore, let's discuss. So with the four wonderful speakers we have, you will see Natasha Hall. Natasha could unfortunately not join us in person today because she's based in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Natasha, for taking the effort to come to us this way. Natasha is a senior fellow with the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And she has over 15 years of experience in different capacities as an analyst, as a researcher, and as a practitioner in complex humanitarian contexts. And this also holds true for Syria. She has worked a lot on Syria. She has been with the Sheikh Group. She has been with the GIZ, with the Mayday Rescue Center for Civilians in Conflict, and the US government's Refugee Affairs Division. So we really can say she has a long record in dealing with Syria. And particularly relevant is a report that she authored last year, which is called Rescuing Aid in Syria. Thank you very much, Natasha, for being here. Let me introduce the others on the panel first before we start with the first question to you. So on my right-hand side, you see Ibrahim Olaibi. Ibrahim is a barrister, and he's with Guernica 37, which is a specialist group of international criminal and human rights lawyers with socially committed and multidisciplinary outlook. He specializes in international law and in the Middle East. And he has been the founder of the Syrian Legal Development Program, of which you probably also have already seen important research and reports on Syria. To my left, there is... To my left, I welcome Carsten Wieland. These days, I mainly deal with him because he's the Middle East advisor for the Green Party in the German parliament. He's also a diplomat and a former senior UN advisor to the political process on Syria. He's also associate fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy and a senior research fellow at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. But the reason why we thought we should have him here is that he authored a book. I brought it here to you. It's called Syria and the Neutrality Trap, and it deals with delivering aid in complex contexts, particularly humanitarian aid through violent regimes and all the dilemmata this involves. So welcome, Carsten. And to my very left, there is Zanofi Skaya. She's Director for Humanitarian Assistance at the German Federal Foreign Office. Also, she has a long record in working in humanitarian aid and working with the complex international challenges that go along with it, because she also worked on humanitarian affairs for the Chancellery in Berlin and for the German permanent missions to the United Nations in New York and Geneva. So also very much welcome. So now I'd like to have a first round on the panel in which each of the panelists has 5 to 7 minutes to elaborate on a specific topic, and I'd like to give each of them a specific question. I already mentioned, Natasha, you wrote this report, Rescuing Aid in Syria, which is a very thorough study on humanitarian aid funds and how they were used in Syria. Could you maybe just kindly introduce us to the report and to the main findings?
Be amongst... Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Thank you very much.
Okay. It's so nice to be amongst esteemed colleagues and friends on the panel, and I'm sure in the audience as well. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you today. So yeah, in that paper, Rescuing Aid in Syria, I essentially lay out how we got to this point over the past 12 years. I'm not going to draw out the details of the 60-page report, though I recommend reading it if you haven't, because I think other reports that have come out since begin to make a lot more sense if you read it. Essentially what I say is that overdependence on humanitarian aid for this crisis created numerous bad compromises that we're still living with today. There is essentially no safe space to report abuse when it occurs, and when it is reported, it tends to be the reporter that faces consequences rather than the accused. And that environment has gotten us to this point. I think one WHO official that I interviewed put it well by saying, we used to have leadership that knew it was making bad compromises, and now we have leadership that is almost admiring of the regime. So with that in mind, and this decade of manipulation and compromises, the reports from the last year, and I think years past, shouldn't be especially surprising. AP reported late last year that the head of WHO in Damascus pressured her staff to sign contracts with high-ranking Syrian government politicians and consistently misspent WHO and donor funds, giving cars, jobs, gold to Syrian regime officials and their relatives. Another report in New Lines reported that aid is openly sold in the market and diverted to the military. My report also mentioned this as well. Another piece from the Syrian Legal Development Program, also affiliated with Ibrahim Olebi, reported that 47% of UN procurement contracts were awarded to risky or high-risk suppliers between 2019 and 2020. With the caveat that the number is likely higher, since the identity of 20% of procurement contracts are suppressed, which is the highest suppression rate of any other humanitarian response. Myself and Karam Shah also reported a year and a half ago that about 51% of every dollar in UN aid exchanged in Syria was lost in the exchange rate. And every time any report comes out, the retort is that things have changed. I've been hearing that for over 10 years now. But today, the exchange rate imposed on the UN is 46% that of the prevailing rate on the market, and significantly different than the exchange rate imposed on others. While Dr. Magtimova, who was the head of the WHO response in Damascus, left the response, she remained head of the WHO while a pandemic was raging. And while I can tell you, based on my own research from the report, that the highest levels of the response knew about these issues. The retort on the SLDP paper, since it's come out, is that these are figures from 2020 and they're outdated. Maybe. But in 2021, I can tell you that that's the newest information that we have open source. Over $6 million went to notorious companies that are sanctioned and or implicated in human rights violations directly. So given all of that, and I noted this in the report as well as other speaking events, what keeps me up at night isn't actually what we know, it's what we don't know. And I'm sure that more could be uncovered, but to me, it's unclear that knowledge in and of itself would produce different outcomes in the case of Syria. As a child protection advocate, Andrew Vax said, I want to disabuse people of the idea that knowledge is power. Knowing how to get to Detroit is not the same thing as having the bus fare. And I'm sure many journalists and analysts and humanitarian workers can identify with that sentiment in Syria, which has been one of the most heavily scrutinized conflicts in history. The reality is that knowledge is only power if you or the powers that be are willing and able to act on it. And authoritarian regimes all over the world are learning from Syria and they're acting on it. In Ethiopia, the government enforced a blockade of the Tigray region for 2 years as Russia and China helped the Ethiopian government by delaying meetings at the Security Council to discuss the declaration of famine in Tigray. So authoritarian regimes are learning and acting collectively. That's without a doubt. So my question today is, are we or will we? Because I think that answering that is important for Syria and for other contexts as we enter a multipolar world, and crises will become more protracted as conflicts remain unresolved, as member states protect regimes' ability to manipulate humanitarian aid, and as we also feel the effects of climate change, which will be another exacerbator. And it's already happened. The number of active conflicts has already nearly doubled in the world, and the average length of these crises has more than tripled since 2005. So getting any protracted aid response right in these complex emergencies is going to be more important and more difficult than ever before. So I think the question, and hopefully we get into this in the question and answer, is what do donor governments and aid organizations do about this? Because these aren't easy questions, and there's no easy answers. And I won't pretend like I have all the answers. And the first thing that we should all say is that humanitarian aid in and of itself is not the answer to political crises and war crimes, and it never can be. It wasn't in Ethiopia in 1984, it wasn't in Zaire in 1994, and it's not in today in Syria. But I would say that since we are spending money on humanitarian aid, obtaining knowledge and acting upon it collectively would be a good start. And this is probably the most important recommendation in that report. That we should be exercising, let's call it strategic humanitarianism. First, on the issues that we know about, like the reports I just mentioned, there needs to be more unity on the part of donors and the aid community for greater negotiating power to remedy those problems. On the cross-border response, which I hope we get into in the discussion, there's a need for a short and a long-term approach. In the short term, the cross-border response, with or without a security resolution, desperately needs to be reinvigorated. And I just published a piece with Foreign Affairs explaining why. Over the long term, member states need to find ways to enshrine the right to humanitarian assistance and extricate that aid from great power competition. And then in other cases, I think we just need more information to make more informed decisions. We need more independent and conflict-sensitive research and monitoring on how current aid resources are used, including early recovery and cross-line aid, which has increased since I even wrote the report. And just to give you an example, I think many assume that early recovery is either great or it's terrible. And the reality is that both opinions are political rather than based in fact. The reality is that analyses that we do have of early recovery programming in conflict-affected countries has had mixed to negative results. and we need to better understand why and if there are ways to overcome those challenges. I'll leave the rest to the discussion, but I did want to conclude on a slightly different note, given what we're talking about. In spite of the challenges that I mentioned, aid organizations with donor funds have done really incredible work. I've seen it and I've been a part of it over the past decade. People are alive because of the response. Children are going to school because of it. People have livelihoods and healthcare because of it. So finding a better way over the long term is really essential for peace and security, but I think also humanitarianism and of course for Syrians.
Thank you, Natasha. A lot of important and very relevant points for the discussion already were covered by what you said here, and I think we'll come back to several of these. However, now I'd first like to ask Carsten, I mean, you also looked into what Natasha tackled in very practical terms. Could you maybe elaborate more? What made you write this book on the neutrality trap, and what is it to start with?
Yeah, thank you, Bente. I was puzzled when I worked for a couple of years as an advisor for the UN envoy who deals with the political process on Syria. I didn't work on humanitarian issues. I think that's why I could write the book, otherwise I would have been too involved. But I was puzzled to see that at times of the conflict, the regime in Damascus received about 90% of the humanitarian aid into Damascus, while the same regime was responsible for 90% of the civilian deaths and destruction and humanitarian suffering. And so I tried to find out, why is this happening? And I saw the discussions in Germany, but also in other governments, about the right response to such a huge crisis where the government is actually the responsible for most of the suffering. We do have an international practice, and it's not more, not less than an international practice to deliver humanitarian aid to governments, first of all. And there was this discussion, look, it's the UN, it's an established channel, it can also handle large amounts of money and also large operations. But the money somehow goes where the rockets are being launched to Damascus and not where they land and cause the destruction. Because in the north of Syria, there was no way of delivering aid except some NGOs, which I call in the book also guerrilla NGOs, kind of sneaked in to the northern territories to establish makeshift clinics in basements that were bombed, etc. But they were not regarded as humanitarian actors. At the beginning, at least, when you talk to the smaller NGOs, they say, we got a lot of skepticism if we are neutral and impartial because we go to the rebel areas. So they equaled us with supporters of the rebels. So that was a huge discussion. That was something that Syria triggered in 2011 and 12. Today we have moved on a bit and we see that a lot of these NGOs do their cross-border work without the necessity of the UN Security Council because they're not UN bound. And they are considered, and they have established their reputation to be humanitarian. But what I want to write, or wanted to express in the book is also that all these discussions that we are having every 6 months on cross-border aid is actually only the surface of the real issues. There's a lot of other discussion behind that. There's the discussion of why are we in that situation? Because cross-line doesn't work. That's why we need cross-border. So there is a government in place. Actually, when I talk about regime, I define it as government plus the intelligence agencies, mukhabarat, militias, etc. So the wider regime that wages the war is a regime that applies all kinds of means available for its warfare. So I call it integrative warfare. So you take humanitarian aid, you take all means of warfare, including besieging areas, starving people to death. And the humanitarian aid that comes in is not only valuable as a financial resource to prolong the war, but also a reputational resource, a legitimacy factor for the regime. Because I've seen how much the government representatives of the Syrian government are on the international stage trying to underline their sovereignty and legitimacy, precisely at the moment when their legitimacy was questioned by large parts of the population and their sovereignty was crumbling, especially in those areas where the humanitarian response from the north came in, and the border crossings were not even in control of that regime. So one of the bigger questions is the question of sovereignty behind all this discussion. Are we, since the 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, still in that development of a progressive, that's the international law experts call it a permeable notion of sovereignty, a sovereignty that is conditioned on some fundamentals of humanitarian law and human rights law. In other words, can a government do with its population what it wants, or will it have repercussions internationally? The far end of this discussion is R2P, of course, responsibility to protect. So there was a development in the 90s to say, actually, sovereignty is not unconditional anymore. Like in the Westphalian time, the hard notion of sovereignty is crumbling. But now, if we look at Syria, for example, but there are also other examples, but Syria is probably the most blatant one, there are countries like Russia, like Syria, of course, the usual suspects was North Korea, Venezuela, etc., China in the back. They want to pull back the notion towards hard sovereignty because they know they could be also at the receiving end of action because of their own human rights violations. So this is also one of the bigger topics around it is the question and the struggle about the definitions and notions that we deal with in international law that, as we all know, is in flux. It's a law that develops. The other question that is at stake here is, of course, performance of the UN. Natasha has already hinted at some points. In Syria, we had a situation where the regime wanted the internationals and the humanitarians inside the country. There are other conflicts where humanitarians are getting expelled from the country, getting beaten up and leave us because you are politically on the other side, whatever they get otherwise in that struggle. In Syria, it was the opposite because the regime noticed it's a valuable resource. So they put conditions on these operations. In 2012, there was a time when the regime was with its back to the wall, and in 13 and 14 even more. So the question is, as Natasha also hinted at, could have been there a better bargaining or a more collective bargaining of the UN on the conditions of operating in that country? Of course, humanitarian actors do have to deal, and I have a lot of respect, do have to deal with the very difficult partners and unscrupulous partners on the ground, governments, etc. But there are also limits. We have seen it in 1993 in the Bosnian War, where the UNHCR suddenly stopped all humanitarian deliveries because the parties were not cooperating. And suddenly the parties crept back to the UN and said, please give us humanitarian aid. And then they resumed the aid without the conditions that were in place before. But in Syria, this never happened. In Yemen, also the UN took a tougher stance and said, actually, we are not delivering anymore. But I know it's a tough dilemma, and also Natasha, of course, pointed it out. Any humanitarian aid reaches some people. The question is, by definition, does it reach the most needy? Does it reach in a neutral and impartial manner to the most needy? And does it reach as many needy as possible? In Syria, I think we can say almost no to all of these questions, at least for some times of this conflict, especially when you had a government that besieged areas and starved population to death. That's why cross-line doesn't make sense for this government, because it's actually fighting a war against large parts of its population, so why should it let a humanitarian aid go through? Now, I'm closing perhaps with a few thoughts on what to do, why business as usual, I think, would be difficult after the lessons learned from Syria. So one is the argument that is actually the need-based argument. As I just said, the aid does not reach the most needy, so it's not a principled humanitarian exercise. It does not reach the persons in definition that should reach this aid by impartial and neutral humanitarian deliveries. The other argument would be actually the argument of international humanitarian law, and I don't want to talk too much about it because I think in the second round we'll discuss a bit more. is the UN Security Council necessary every 6 months to bless these actions of the UN cross-border-wise or not? And it is not. The third argument would be, and that's why one could actually embark and strengthen this position legally and politically as a consequence and as a lesson learned from this conflict. Now we have also a value-based argumentation. A regime that receives so many resources from international donors and misleads, blocks, kind of circumvents rules of international humanitarian law that was painstakingly established since the Geneva Conventions, does violate our universal values. And I'm talking about universal values because all these countries are members of the UN, where these values are based in the Charter, are enshrined in the UN Charter, and these countries are voluntary members of the UN. We should always remember this. These are not Western values.
Thank you, Carsten. I don't want to cut you
All
short,
right.
but you just mentioned before that something that I would like to give to Ibrahim because, well, Natasha already mentioned 51% of each dollar going directly into the pockets of the regime by currency exchange. You mentioned it should reach the most needy, and these are the ones that are not really addressed or not really reached by what is being delivered. And here I would like to ask you, Ibrahim, because one of the studies that you were involved in was on UN procurement contracts in Syria. And it has the title, the subtitle, A Few Bad Apples, ? And you talk about the top 100 suppliers that are then under contract by the UN. What are your findings here? Who is this money going to? I mean, the remaining 49% of what's coming in, how is it being distributed? Who does it, in fact, reach?
Thank you so much, Bente, for inviting me to the first event of the year, which adds a little bit of pressure. Before I talk about the study, coming here, I was wondering, why would anyone in the audience care about the study, right? What does it make? What difference does it make to the German population, those who care, where aid is going into Syria, right? Because this is, why is it the subject that matters? We all know that foreign policy is 95% domestic policy. So what is the impact of this, something happening so far away, no longer in the news, on you? And I think the list is quite large. And so to start with, there's this issue of extremism, right? People go hungry, they become desperate, it becomes difficult. It starts attracting people and foreign fighters from across, a problem that Europe suffered from when the Syrian crisis started. It's your taxpayer money that is going to the wrong hands. It is the issue of soft power, right? It is the countries give money because they want to exert influence, and they give humanitarian aid in order to exert influence. It affects norms that then other, as Natasha said, dictators learn from, Russia, that then are applied in Ukraine, that Germany feels the direct impact of. One of the biggest manipulators of aid is the Syrian regime with the backing of Russia. And then the last point, it makes you feel good. Giving charity and giving humanitarian aid makes you feel good. So the open-ended question that I hope to answer towards the end without this becoming a psychological session is that should you feel good when there is humanitarian aid going into Syria? Now we know that politicians feel good about humanitarian aid. It's easy, right? 2011 started, the whole issue was, a political transition, a dictatorship must go. There was a lot of issues around that. Then that became a political taboo. So let's talk about human rights, slightly safer. We talk about human rights, we talk about accountability, we get a red line drawn on the sand on chemical weapons, that red line gets passed, nothing happens. Even accountability, Syria became a war, not a crime scene. So perhaps, let's not talk about accountability. So let's talk about aid. Biggest aid program, the UK says, goes to Syria. I don't know where it stands in Germany, but it's probably high. Billions of dollars going to aid in Syria, because that is the most politically comforting decision to take. But is it in the Syrian context? Is it without repercussions? Is it going to where it's supposed to go? Is it creating that positive effect that people and politicians alike should feel good about themselves? And I think without going into too much detail, I thank Natasha for actually shedding light on some of things of the report, because then it allows me to shed light on more of the policy issues. But in 2016, ever since actually 2014, reports were coming out that, your money is being used to buy from perpetrators who are directly fueling the conflict. So on one hand, you want this conflict to end, and people to stay, but then you're funding humanitarian actors who part of their money is going to the same warlords that are kind of fueling the conflict that you're trying to end, in that sense. So there was an article in The Guardian by Emma Beals in 2014, 2016, 2018, Bloomberg, and so on. And so we wanted to see, when we spoke to governments, and in that context, and in my kind of Syrian legal development program hat, and the question was always from politicians, well, there's nothing we can do about Syria, or Russia, Iran, and so on. So I said, let's go to a place where you can do something. You're the ones funding the UN. It's not Russia funding the UN. It's not Iran funding the UN. It's your money, so you must have some leverage. So we led a team to focus particularly on the procurement issue. Very clear, boring contractual matters. Does not involve, it's processes, it's bureaucracies. We love bureaucracies. Let us see can we have any leverage on this matter? So we started engaging with some UN agencies, and the response came back to us. It's like, these are few bad apples. Ibrahim, you should look at the bigger picture. Some, warlord-sanctioned individuals might be a problem, but hey, let's be a bigger picture person. And I took that diplomat sentence, a few bad apples, and we titled it, we focused the report entirely on it. And I don't want to even call them apples, because apples in the end it's a good, nutritious fruit. We're talking about warlords and criminals in this case. So together with the Observatory for Political and Economic Networks, led by our colleague Karam, the Syrian Legal Development Program decided to look at the biggest 100 suppliers in 2019 and 2020. So the results, as Natasha has said, shocking. Sanctioned individuals, people at the Foreign Office who work so hard to get individuals sanctioned in order to strive them from economic means, are making their means through humanitarian aid because, one, the UN is not bound by those sanctions, two, because they're EU and the UK and the US, and two, because even if they're bound, they're subject to humanitarian exemptions. So that's exactly what Natasha was talking about. Perpetrators understood that reconstruction requires a political transition and is a bit too hot, so let me, instead of creating a cement factory, create a factory that sells diapers. Because it's the same warlord, benefits of economies of scale, has the access, let me sell the things that humanitarians will buy from me. And they learned that lesson, and that's exactly what happened in Syria. So we found sanctioned individuals amongst those, European sanctioned individuals. We saw individuals who are responsible for massacres. And the shocking bit is not as that we found individuals as if we say, I put a wig on, as a barrister I do that, but a different wig on and went to Damascus and was trying to figure out who those people are. Primary data from the Syrian Gazette. Simple open source information, things that, takes a couple of hours to identify that these are warlords and are part of it. So the outcome was that it's not few bad apples. And there's a lot that can be done. Now, we're lucky that, Natasha, I'm happy to say that the UN now is a little bit more engaging because governments became more engaged. Because the UN used to blame governments. Governments would say, well, it's the UN, it's the large institution, to your point, so where do we start with this? But finally, we're seeing some movement, and all what we're asking is better human rights due diligence, better vetting of who your suppliers are, better looking into who those people are, and then the politicians making the difficult decision. Do I want to continue aid in these circumstances? Yes and no. Am I able to live with the consequences? And these are not easy choices. Humanitarian aid has been presented to be this easy thing. It's not. But the incentive structure, even the career progressive incentive structure of those who work in humanitarian aid is how many people can you feed with as much little money? And the problem in a conflict like Syria, that those who can sell at half the price, in order for you to take your career next advancement box of how many people you fed with $100, are the people who benefit from regime cronyism and are the warlords. So we need to look at it even politically from a different incentive structure in order to be able to solve this problem, which are solvable. So yes, you should feel good about humanitarian aid, but you should not take it for granted. And you should do whatever you can to really try and improve the situation, because you can.
I mean, if you look at the report, it is really astonishing how many names you were able to identify. And I mean, one of the most prominent, Faris Sakr being involved, who is responsible for the Tadamon massacre in 2013. So yes, there is a lot we can know. And I know the German Foreign Office has looked into all these affairs and is aware of many of the problems. But for us, of course, it would be interesting to know, how are you going about these dilemmata, these problems? What has already been done to mitigate the impact, or are there any new initiatives, any new approaches to this?
Thank you very much, Bente, and thank you very much for inviting me. And I have to say, I am really happy, and it's a great pleasure for me to sit here with such distinguished experts who worked such a long time on Syria. And in fact, when I started my posting or new job as Director for Humanitarian Assistance in the Foreign Office, Carsten sent me his book and wished me good luck. And already then, of course, I knew from my previous work in Geneva that the job would be quite challenging, and especially on Syria. And of course, I also read the studies and very good papers of Natasha and Ibrahim, and with great interest. And of course, they're extremely important, but as well disturbing in a way. And I have to say, these studies really help us, because they help us to monitor the situation, to get a better analysis, and it helps us to push the UN and partners on the ground to constantly question their way of operating, and also the way with whom they work. So maybe, if I may, I would like to make 3 points. So the first point is, in general, and Natasha also alluded to this, humanitarian assistance as such is getting more and more complicated and more dangerous. Last year, more humanitarian workers than ever before have been killed. The UN has now estimates that an unprecedented number of 339 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance worldwide, and 51 billion would be needed just to serve a few of them. And of course, in Syria, it's the same. Now, we're 12 years into the conflict, and now the estimate is around 15 million people in need, more than ever before. And of course, this is really a worldwide, unfortunate negative trend. But I totally agree that Syria is an extreme example, and it's unique in its complexity. So you mentioned it at the beginning, so the totally different regions, the internal and external actors, and of course the way in which international humanitarian law is and was violated. So that brings me to my second point. All of you in your papers and today you mentioned the dilemma humanitarian workers are working in, and especially in Syria. So the dilemma of abiding, observing, working according to the humanitarian principles on the one hand, and on the other hand, to serve as many people and help as many people with humanitarian assistance as you can, wherever they live. And by the way, so the humanitarian assistance Germany gives and our other big partners never goes directly to the Syrian regime. It always goes through international organizations and NGOs, but I will come to this point later on. So it is always a very difficult way, and I think in one of your papers it says humanitarian workers always are between a rock and a hard place. And I think that's absolutely correct. And that doesn't mean that, so it is difficult, it's a case-by-case decision, and that doesn't mean that we as donors are not responsible. We are, and we have to ask these difficult questions, and we do. But on the other hand, we also have to trust the UN and the NGOs and partners who are on the ground, who give us their assessment and who help to implement the programs that we jointly prioritized. as I said before, experts like you and our own third monitoring partners, they help us to really dig deeper. And we know that the UN is under an extreme pressure by the Syrian regime, and they have to sort of walk a tightrope walk in every day. So that brings me to my third point, and maybe the most interesting point for you. What can we do about it, and what do we do about it? So I think it's needless to say that we, on different levels as donors, sit together, we discuss it with the UN, together with the donors, to try and find new ways so that it is not business as usual, as you said. What can we do to really walk this very difficult walk? And as I said, we know that so the UN has given themselves principles and parameters according according to the humanitarian principles, and on the one hand, we have to help them to implement it. That means if we know that they're under pressure, we have to help them. And for example, they are always in danger of being expelled, of not getting their visas. And I can assure you, and of course it's confidential, I can't go into too much detail, but I can assure you that they use their leverage, that they have a very robust talk, and that they do some of the things that you also mentioned they should do. But because it's sometimes better you do this behind closed doors, but we know that they do it, and that they exactly, if the regime comes and says, we would like to divert it only to people whom we like, this is absolutely not correct and not possible, and I can assure you that then the UN will sort of do whatever they can to prevent that, and they have our backing. So that's the one thing. But the other thing is, of course, that we push the UN to questioning their way of operating, and if so, pure procurement, for example, very good point in case. So we set up a new region, it's called Regional Dialogue Mechanism, and we sit together with the UN and a broad donor base, and we talk especially with this, and you can be sure that we talked about the report you mentioned, and again, I can't go too much into details, but I can assure you that it had its effects, and so it changed some of the supply chains. So, so this brings me then to my very last point. This is that, of course, we, as Germany, we are still extremely concerned about the humanitarian situation in Syria. And last year, we, together with the Ministry of Development Cooperation, we gave around 1 billion for Syria. And we want to be and to continue to be engaged. And because Natasha at the very end mentioned that we are doing good things with the money, I just want, because I think it's really important, mention some figures. So with the money Germany gave to Syria as humanitarian aid, 5.8 million people per month got food assistance. Many children got fortified snacks. We created more than 10,000 additional jobs. We improved education for thousands of children and access for 1.5 million people at least to safe drinking water. And I think, irrespective of all the problems, this is really something that was helpful and that saved people's lives. And it is absolutely correct that you said we need a political solution. And of course, the Foreign Ministry supports Pedersen in his constant way to try and bring the Syrian regime to move and to get out of the deadlock. So humanitarian assistance alone cannot solve the problems, but it really does something good. And just my very last point, we of course don't want only to be payers, but also players. And that's why we'll use our leverage now and convene senior officials meeting before the next Brussels meeting, and it will be in Berlin. So it was decided just a few hours ago, so you're the first to know, and I think you might like that. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, there's so many points that would be worth digging into deeper. I'm afraid that I let myself being taken away by all your interesting inputs. So we're already 1 hour into the discussion, and I still have questions. And I would also like to give the audience a chance to ask questions. So in the next round, I'd kindly ask you to be very much to the point, if possible. And for the audience, if you think about commenting or asking questions, please also try to prepare for swift questions so we can benefit as much of the expertise that we have here. And Natasha, let me come back to you. In your really great article in Foreign Affairs, you explain a bit more what the problem is with a mandate that only covers 6 months. So there are a lot of implications to cross-line aid so that we have not yet mentioned in the first round. Could you maybe elaborate a bit further on these problems?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for giving me the chance to explain that further. I mean, in the Foreign Affairs article, I talk a bit more broadly about the strategic issues at play if cross-border aid or alternative modalities of aid aren't allowed in the context of Syria and other complex emergencies. But to speak a bit more to your point on Syria as an example, I've heard over and over again that cross-line aid is another modality or just another modality. And I find that fascinating for potentially the same reasons that Karsten found it fascinating and wrote his book, because it's not another modality, right? I think if anyone has picked up a newspaper in the past 10 years, they would maybe understand that. In 2017, 5 million people were in besieged or hard to reach areas, the vast majority of them in hard to reach areas because of the regime. 2/3 of the people in northwest Syria that benefit from the current cross-border response are the victims of that aerial bombardment and those sieges. So I think if we had examples of cross-line aid having radically changed, maybe that would be different. But that's simply not the case. And I get into some of those issues in the report, Rescuing Aid in Syria, in both the Northeast and the Northwest. And yet still, we've seen, or at least I've heard from UN officials in September, that they were going to increase cross-line convoys by 5 times. There's been multiple issues with the existing cross-line convoys for potentially obvious reasons. But this also means resources are redirected towards Damascus as time goes on. And actually I won't say who it was, but one of the European donors that I spoke to right after the publication of my report said that cross-line aid is the way of the future. I think if we want to properly manage this crisis, it can't be the way of the future unless something radically changes within this conflict. There are dwindling aid resources, as Bente and others mentioned. There is or there will be donor fatigue. So increasing the efficiency of existing aid resources is really essential. And then finally, I think a point that I think gets lost a bit, and Karsten spoke to this to a certain degree, but the regime allowed the international aid community to stay in Syria, in Damascus, for 2 reasons. One, for the resources that we're talking about, to sort of redirect resources in a way that it saw fit as a tactic of war, but also to control the narrative. And we saw this in many ways throughout the conflict while I was working in Gaziantep, in Lebanon, and Jordan. Other UN hubs would constantly battle the UN Damascus hub about the classification of besieged areas. Places like Madaya, for example, were not listed as besieged. The UN sort of kept that close to its vest, even though most of the UN and the humanitarian community knew that children were already starving to death. If this goes on, if the cross-border response continues to atrophy, the whole of Syria response will be non-existent. There will be no pushback on the narratives, on the information that we're hearing from Damascus. And again, as I outline in my report, as Karsten has outlined in his book, there are issues, significant issues with that. And I think that, if we want to properly meet the needs of those in need in non-government controlled areas, which is absolutely essential as long as this crisis goes on for, then that cross-border response is absolutely necessary. And so I've talked about, and Ibrahim has also written an excellent report on ways to disentangle the cross-border response from the Security Council resolution as much as possible. Not just for the Syrian context, I would say, but I would say that this is a strategic and geopolitical issue around the world. Karsten alluded to this, but certainly we are entering a world where we've shifted away from notions of responsibility to protect to notions of more sort of archaic, inviolable sovereignty, even in the face of war crimes and siege warfare. And so I think to properly manage those crises, for humanitarians to be able to hold on to principled humanitarian aid and to their neutrality, we need to be able to extract them from great power competition that's about to unfold.
Thank you. I mean, you mentioned some of the obstacles across line deliveries and the sieges where we really could study it. And you, Ms. Frieskaya, earlier said that the donors and the UN were doing everything to make aid reach the spots that were needed. But I mean, whoever followed the delivery of aid convoys into besieged areas, it was excruciating only to watch this and see how much effort one single convoy would take until it was granted. Only a tiny share of convoys that were asked for were ever approved, and then the delivery really was a problem. So given all these problems, Ibrahim, you also did a study. Cross-border aid is legal was the initiative that came out of it, and it's a legal study that gives us hints how to get around the necessity of a mandate of the UN Security Council. Could you maybe share with us the findings of this? And please keep in mind you're being interpreted into German, so slow down a bit.
So in 2014, a group of very eminent scholars, including former Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs at the UN, published an article in The Guardian alongside 35 others, top professors, the people that I have their books behind my shelves and I have boy crushes on, published a paper saying there is no legal barrier for the UN to deliver aid into Syria. A few months later, we get a Security Council resolution that says, now we're starting a cross-border modality. And so in a way, what happened in 2014 was the UN Security Council decided to intervene because the conflict, the facts on the ground, the complications, the amount of border crossings, the modality, maybe did not have the time or the luxury of the time to have interpretations and lawyers saying one thing and other lawyers saying another. And so you went for the highest legal executive order style kind of legal remit. And that's what happened, and the resolution got renewed every year and so on until the drama started happening. And Russia realized that this is a bargaining tool because that resolution was not so much relevant when the countries were happy to talk about political issues and human rights issues, but as the political interest in Syria dwindled and the humanitarian issue became the main thing, Russia was like, this is my moment now to start, getting something that I can get out of this. And so we saw more intense negotiations, threats of vetoes, language needs to be inserted that is highly, highly problematic. Mandates instead of 12 months being shortened to 6 months. And that became even more relevant after Ukraine, at a time where the world was isolating Russia. The first time the whole drama came back again to Russia and diplomats were speaking to the Russians in a very active way, was on this humanitarian resolution. Now, in parallel to that, every time Syrian organizations would go to the UN with every vote and say, why do we need this vote legally? No one can explain. The legal opinion is not published. No one has seen it. Governments have not seen it. It was not clear. And they were told, shh, you're a little cute Syrian who doesn't understand international law. This is how things work. So a group of Syrians, Syrian American organizations, decided to say no. Even if it's just for a historical purpose, that Syrians were not taken for granted, that this is just a legal question that is way above your head, let us really examine this. And they got in touch with myself. I was studying in Oxford at the time, so I couldn't pick it up. And so I asked my colleague, Jack Sproson, to lead a team of 5 lawyers to look into this issue. Leave no stone unturned. And Jack told me, you're crazy. Because one, this is unprecedented. We never needed or had a Security Council resolution allowing aid in the same way we did. Lawyers love precedent. No precedent. Lawyers love judges or hate them, but we need a judge. We need juries. We need someone to make a call. Who am I advocating with? There is none, or there are too many in this situation. And so over the Syrian organizations in the US, the American Coalition for Syria, took the risk that they're going to fund this research to look at whether objectively there are arguments to be put forward. About 8 months later, the answer was yes. There are credible legal arguments that say you never needed a Security Council resolution in the first place. It's good that we had one. It killed the legal debate. You know, lawyers love legal debates. That's why we have jobs. It's about interpretation. It's not 0 and 1. It's not programming. And so the Security Council may have ended that debate or postponed it, but that doesn't mean there's an interpretation that is backed now with letters that we have in the making by former International Court of Justice judges who are saying, no, this is possible. It can be done. But then we got into the issue, okay, if it is legally possible, how can countries who have been saying for the last 8 years a renewal must take place happen? How does it work from a tactical perspective that the UN comes out on January 11th, and you know, this was one of the most difficult panels to prepare with, because this topic, I would have been very different if yesterday the vote went, was it yesterday? 2 days ago, the vote went differently. If there was a veto on the 9th of January, could the Secretary General wake up next morning and say, aha, I never needed a Security Council in the first place, I'm going to do this anyways? And the answer is no. So, but at least we've managed to deal with this legal question. We'll continue to work because there are so many actors within the UN and governments who want to see this aid continued. But it's a complicated process. And all what we're saying is that while the Security Council resolutions on the facts of 2014 might have been needed, it is no longer needed in 2023. And the facts have changed, and there are ways to end this blackmail. The blackmail politically, the blackmail operationally. A 6-month extension, none of you, I guarantee you, would change a job to travel to another country if you have a 6-month contract. You will not reallocate your family. You will not have enough time to put children in school. It's not enough stability. We all ask for a year or permanent contracts these days. How are we expecting humanitarians to do it? The effectiveness. Crossing a border from Turkey where the majority of procurement happens a few kilometers in is very different than coming from Beirut and the procurement and Damascus and up. So even from an economic perspective, cross-border needs to be continued. So I'm confident that with the benevolent actors within the UN, the excellent lawyers that exist, the governments that are supportive of this, would be happy to depoliticize aid, to finally take it out of the hands of the 15 who at some point did a fantastic job and maintained consensus, but are now no longer able to do so. And so we must result to find durable ways. And that 70-page legal report that I would, unless you have a huge legal interest in looking at this, does argue that there are legal processes, and we should really do it in order not to just interrupt the 4.1 million lives that depend on it. For once, lawyers are able to be enablers for the future rather than deal with accountability. But change the landscape if we don't deal with this. We are changing the landscape of international law as we know it today, and we must not let that happen.
Well, you just mentioned, could the Secretary General wake up the next day after a veto and say, no, I never needed a mandate? I like this quote, and I would like to give this question actually to you. Would it be possible to maybe do it the other way around, say, well, we have watched, for many years we have been going along with this and with the constant insecurity, whether it would be extended or not. I mean, this time it went smoothly, but I remember last summer it was really a very complicated process. It gives Russia a lot of power, each member of the Security Council a lot of power over humanitarian affairs. Would it be an option to now say, no, that we have these 6 months, maybe we right away come up with a way to do cross-border aid without asking for a mandate?
So, as I myself have been part of this very tedious discussions in New York, and while I was working on Security Council issues in Capital, and you might remember in 1920 we were the pen holder in Germany when we were a non-permanent member in the Security Council, and it was really disheartening to see how Russia managed to hold the issue of humanitarian assistance hostage and really sort of reduced the crossings that we had to just the Bab el Harbor that we have right now. So not Jordan, Iraq, all the others, they were closed down, and it was reduced to 6 months. So I was really happy to see that the resolution was prolonged, because this is really necessary. This is a lifeline for 4.1 million people still. And I totally agree with what Natasha said. Cross-border will never be a substitute. So Norway and Ireland did a very good job, and I hope that Brazil and Switzerland will do the same job, because we will, in July, we will probably have to discuss the resolution again in the Security Council. And Ibrahim, you're right, there are different legal opinions, and there is a discussion. And I think you build a quite interesting case that the resolution might not have been necessary in the first place, or maybe now it's not necessary anymore. However, you mentioned as well, 8 years we have a precedent. And it is in my opinion, it will be very difficult to argue, to build the case that it wasn't necessary. However, I think we have to be prepared, because it can be that in July it will not be prolonged. And so we, as donors, together with the UN, we of course started already a while ago to think about complementary measures, because I think this is the way to go. We cannot sort of, it might be as well an option, so I won't exclude it, but I think July, half a year, so we have to start thinking, and I can assure you, we do that. And so, because we need some way or the other to bring assistance in also cross-border, and we have the Cross-Border Humanitarian Fund. You know that Germany is the largest donor, and sort of, yeah, we were really interested that this will continue, and we'll hopefully find a way.
Before I ask the last question on the panel to you, Carsten, I'd like to ask you to think about whether you might want to ask or comment something. I'd like you to come forward to the microphone. I know that you will be able to talk loudly, and we're not that many. It's just that the interpreters will not be able to hear you the same as well as Natasha. This is why I'd kindly ask you to use the microphone. So, Carsten, we've heard a lot about the necessities to deal with things differently, and I'd like you, from your direct view of negotiations, do you think that benefiting from humanitarian aid the way the regime does it now, and I mean, it's a significant amount, and it's basically the largest legal share that of foreign currency the regime gets hold of through this way of aid delivery. Do you think that this is important enough for the regime to be more flexible on conditions being imposed to it? I mean, Natasha also has been writing on it, so maybe she also would like to do a short comment on that. But what would you say? Is that so important for the regime that they might show some flexibility?
Well, I don't think that the regime is necessarily strongly pressured. At the moment, it's even more difficult to impose new rules, I would say. I think in 2012, it was probably the moment to do so. And maybe we can also turn around the question when it comes to the Security Council. Why did Russia in the first place voted yes this time? And why did Russia not decide to block it already and to go, forward, saying this is a normal country, sovereignty? That's the narrative, right? That's why also we need not only humanitarian aid, but we also need reconstruction. Now, wake up, international community, this country is normal again. Well, we all know that the people are not coming back to Syria, the refugees, because they are missing houses or missing water or missing electricity. They're afraid of their lives because nothing has changed in human rights, nothing has changed in governance. And that is being discussed in Geneva. So we have seen a constant reluctancy to engage in these negotiations in Geneva, also to kind of curtail or to diminish these negotiations into a single box, which is a constitutional debate. Now, we all know that in this region of the world, even more, nothing changes with a new piece of paper. You need other things that really make a difference on the ground. So, but why did Russia not decide to block it altogether? There are various interpretations, but one part of the picture is that they are controlling part of the narrative and perhaps extorting benefits from it. So in the resolution that has been prolonged right now, it's the first time that they managed to include early recovery, which is something like humanitarian plus or something that comes before reconstruction, at least something not purely humanitarian, something more than humanitarian, into that paper. So when I talked earlier about this tug of war of interpretations of international law, humanitarian law, this is exactly where it's taking place. So is humanitarian aid a transactional good or is it an unconditional matter? So from the Geneva Conventions onwards, it's an unconditional matter. That's why it's neutral, or it's supposed to be neutral and impartial. Now, when you enter other things into it that the regime should get, you say, give us more reconstruction, then you can do more cross-border. You start trading things that are not tradable. So that's one big issue that is kind of connected to this resolution. And another example that I heard when I researched the book was from a German diplomat as well, who was involved in negotiations for many, many years on humanitarian issues. And he said, previously consensual formulations are now being questioned. For example, it was always said that cross-border humanitarian aid needs the consent of the host country, of the so-called high contracting party. Now, Russia, Syria, and the usual suspects, they managed somehow to block that and to say it needs the full consent of the host country. But it's, of course, semantical nonsense, but we know where it heads towards. And then the humanitarians in the UN told me this has a direct impact on our discussions and interactions with the regime. So the goalpost is shifting towards one corner, and we have to just pull it back to the center and say, look, this is where international humanitarian law and human rights law is. What you are doing is actually trying to pull us into a corner, and we are being pulled into this corner by, of course, also 2014, this kind of walk to the Security Council as you called it, a high managerial decision. It was a progress at that time, 2014, and it was a progress that Russia even didn't block it and saw somehow the international need to do something. But it was also a precedent that we are now in this corner to use the Security Council. And the legal opinions that also Ibrahim has quoted, they say international law has developed and no host country has the right in a massive, and that's important, massive humanitarian crisis. And I think nobody would doubt that Syria is one. The host country is not allowed to block humanitarian aid out of capricious reasons. And that's what the government has been doing. And I know it's all a matter of negotiations, how to soften this stance. And what we can do is, apart from negotiating hard with the regime, or more collectively with the regime on conditions, I would simply say, when you look at the performance of some of the UN responsibles in Damascus, a humanitarian functionary or head of an organization just stop talking political opinions and utter political opinions in the media. I mean, many UN leaders in Damascus, then they said things that support and sustain the narrative of sovereignty, legitimacy of the regime. That's not necessary for their work. You know, so that's what I meant with the credibility issue of the UN. And I do agree, and I have talked to the UN also after publication of the book and these reports. There are sensitivities now that have emerged. There is a tougher discussion within the UN, although there are no formal kind of boards or kind of digestion of what has really happened as criticism since 2014-16. But there are discussions, tougher discussions from the donors. And there are even UN members, UN functionaries who say, and I will end with this, please scrutinize us, the UN, more. Read between the lines of the UN reports, and that's what you've been doing. Look at whom we are contracting, look whom we are employing, family members of the regime partially in Damascus, and then we want also to improve. That's what I heard from the UN in Damascus last year. Thank you.
So you see, we could continue here, but please feel welcome, come forward, ask a question, make a comment, but whatever you do, keep it brief, please. Yes, please.
Ja, ich habe eigentlich eine ganz konkrete Frage, was mir
A concrete question. There is an aspect I haven't heard here in this round. What about Turkey? What about the role played by Turkey? For me, it's interesting because we are also talking about the occupation in the north, which is aggravating the situation.
führt gegen den Nordosten.
And also the struggles in Turkey against the East, which is aggravating the humanitarian situation. So you haven't talked about this aspect, and this is what I missed. And then humanitarian aid comes via Turkey, but the question is, where does it go to? Because it does not reach the northeastern region, i.e. the region where the Syrian democratic forces rule. So I would like to ask the representative of the Foreign Office, what about the NGOs on the spot? Shouldn't they be supported much more because they are helping? And why doesn't the Foreign Office grant direct and immediate support to these little NGOs? And then one more aspect, the Foreign Office tends to say that only in Elso and Raqqa, in the Arab belt, so to speak, initiatives are being supported, but it's a long belt, so to speak. It's a whole big region along the border, so I would like to know more from you about this particular aspect. Are there further questions which are maybe immediately connected to this one?
Kim Bjørnsen. I'm an analyst with the Danish Institute for International Studies and a former Danish stabilization advisor to Syria. I'll only pose one question to our representative from the Federal Foreign Office, asking, because you mentioned in the end of your intervention the good things that the humanitarian aid has been achieving so far in Syria, and there's no question about that. How would you, so to say, classify the bang for the buck, if you like, the question? Because obviously when Germany has provided, I think, 13 billion euros to Syria so far, and the international community, many more billions of euros and dollars, how would you, how in your words, how would you classify the effectiveness of the money that has been sent and the money that has been, so to say, received by those that who actually need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since currently I don't see anybody's hand raised, so maybe we give it back to the panel. And could you maybe start with the questions that were directly directed towards you?
I can do that. Shall I do that in English or answer the question that came in German? So.
Ich glaube, sie hat das Headset auf.
Gerne auf Deutsch oder?
Right. I'll answer in German. I said that the aid we offer is always transferred via the United Nations or NGOs. The question is who has access. We are in the west, in the northeast, and also in the regime area, and we always try to act on the basis of the HRP. We are also stabilizing in the east, so it's not only humanitarian aid, but we also try to make returning possible. And all this is being done community-based, i.e. on a community-based approach, as good as possible or as much as possible. It doesn't always work. Now, concerning Turkey, Turkey has announced to be militarily active again in the south of the country, and this is, of course, worrying us, and this is certainly something the foreign minister will talk about with the representatives.
Difficult question. So it's very difficult to measure the impact and do the, as you said, for the bucket. It is just not the principle of humanitarian assistance. You give according to the humanitarian response plans, and we hope that the actors on the ground can achieve the best that they can. However, there is, of course, an ongoing debate on effectiveness and efficiency deriving from the grand bargain, and you can always be better, and especially in Syria. So this is not, we are always looking for ways to be better, and as you said, not doing business as usual, to adapt and really questioning the ways we all operate.
Thank you. And I think there is another question regarding Turkey and its role. I think here it is also about humanitarian affairs in terms of how much the dependency on Turkey for delivering cross-border in the north is relevant, particularly also noticing Turkey's hostilities, offensives, military attacks on parts of northeastern Syria, as well as its occupation of Afrin.
Sure. So so from the cross-border question, we're talking about UN crossing the border. I mean, again, fun fact: there is no UN crossing the border. It's UN coordinated aid across the border through partners, because the term UN cross-border is actually misleading. But we're talking about UN coordinated aid across the borders into Syria through Syrian organizations. And for that, also, you need the consent of Turkey, right, on the other side of the border. So far, Turkey has been very supportive of the renewal of the mechanism for many reasons one can think about, including, for example, that a lot of these people, the 4.1 million, stayed in this area because they know aid is coming. We were in Gaziantep, and my colleagues were in Syria very recently, and people on the ground monitor the resolution in New York in order to know when to get medicine out of the shelves, when to keep it. It has a direct effect on them. And so for Turkey, I think it's important for this resolution to be renewed, and for Europe, because Russia is also holding Europe hostage with this resolution, for the refugees not to start moving back again to Turkey. So Turkey has been kind of opening the borders, welcoming the UN, facilitating the UN. And in fact, even my understanding is that there was a call between Erdogan and Putin on the renewal. Right? That this is how high it's getting, and now because of Ukraine, the Turkish-Russian dynamics are different, but Turkey is playing that political as well as facilitative role. On the northeast, and this is where it becomes important, it was actually the Russian mandate, Russian negotiations that ended the northeast mandate. We had 4 border crossings, as you said, and then it was the resolution that removed the northeast. The French want the northeast, the Americans want the northeast, the Brits want the northeast in the Security Council. But again, it was how the law, ironically, played a role that the UN can no longer do what it was doing previously and is now doing it inefficiently. So with solving the problem on the legality question, we hope that this would also help UN aid across Syria, wherever it is, but also globally where the relevant laws would apply.
Thank you very much. I think with this, we also reached, unfortunately, the end of this discussion, which I found very interesting. I mean, one of the very important points, of course, is that the solution in the end needs to be political. And as long as we are only delivering humanitarian aid to a conflict that does not see a solution, we will be facing the problems that we have. And with early recovery, it will be the same as with humanitarian aid. I'm very glad to learn how much efforts in terms of studies, analysis, but also policy discussions there is around mitigating the impact, because it is so relevant to say that aid in the Syrian context is maybe misappropriated more than in other contexts, and that this also directly may contribute to further human rights violations. So I think it is not only a humanitarian but highly political affair. So thank you very much. Please stay tuned, because we will continue the discussion. There are further events down the year in which we will certainly look into other subjects, but definitely Syria is dear to our hearts and we consider it relevant. Thank you all for coming, Ms. Friskaya, Carsten, Ibrahim, Natasha. Thank you very much to my colleagues Birgit and Linda, who organized this, as well as Antonia and the Tagungsbüro, as well as the interpreters. It was really great that you were all here. And please come again next time. Thank you very much.